really excited to have you on board today. And my name is Emilia. I'm the community manager here at Toggl Track. So you've been seeing me around for these episodes before. But the new person here is Karl Sakas, who's our guest today. He's an agency advisor with a background from agency operations, and he has helped and consulted tens, if not hundreds, correct me if I'm wrong, agencies all around the globe in scaling their operations, in just doing their work better. And today we have a pretty cool topic, which is all to do with time. Because if there's one resource that is limited, it's time. You can hire more people, but you can't get more hours in your day. And what we see is that a lot of agency owners, and just generally a lot of people in the agencies, are not necessarily optimizing it and putting their efforts, and spending the time on the effort that they should be spending on. So I think it's going to be super useful, and I'm excited to hear what Karl has to share. And the last thing before we get started, as always, we will be sending out the recording to anybody who signed up for the session. So if you can't make the whole session, you're gonna receive the recording in your email later on. So don't worry about it. And the slides, the deck will also be available. And as always, it's also going to be available on Toggl blog. If you want to find it later, if you want to share it with somebody, it will be there. Okay, I'm done with my blah, blah, blahing. And it's time for Karl to take the floor. And I'm really excited to hear what he has to share. So Karl, hi, welcome. And let's see what you have ready for us today.
Thanks, Amelia. Great to be here. And thanks for everyone who's joining, whether live or via the recording later. Today is all about how you can grow your agency by reclaiming your time. Consider, agencies are a tough business. Ultimately, you're surrounded by humans on all sides, your team, your clients, and others, and humans are complicated. Compared to other service businesses, your clients often have a subjective opinion about what is good enough or what is even done about your work. On top of that, for most agency owners, they are accidental agency owners. They fell into the business, not necessarily having a plan to become an agency owner. Yet, for most of the independent agency owners I work with, the agency is your number one or number two financial asset. Your family is depending on you. And as a leader, you are highly visible. Clients tend to assume that you're the one with the best answers, and your team wants to get face time as well. Sometimes it can feel like a target. And this difficulty extends to your daily schedule as well. As an agency owner, everyone wants a piece of your time, and those pieces all add up. And you can never make progress on what's most important. Fortunately, you can take back control and create the schedule and the agency that you deserve. And that is what we will cover today. Here's a preview for this program. We've talked a bit about why it's hard to be an agency owner. And if you are not an owner, you're in a leadership role and you're supporting the owner or owners at your agency, this advice will help you help them. And that's going to be good for your career as well. We'll talk about starting to prioritize what you want. I'll share tips to help you reclaim your time, as well as some of my frameworks in my work working with hundreds of agencies all over the world to help you reclaim your time and shift your agency to what you want it to be. And then we'll have time for Q&A, and I'll share a free resource to help you accelerate your progress as you grow your agency by reclaiming your time. If you aren't familiar with my work before, I'm Karl Sakas. I previously, before becoming an agency advisor, worked in agency operations as a project manager, a director of client services, a director of operations. As an advisor, I've worked one-on-one with over 400 agencies on every inhabited continent, and I've reached hundreds more through my group programs and I guess thousands with my free content. I'm the author of 3 books. The latest is Work Less, Earn More. That's previewed here on the screen, as well as hundreds of articles on agency management published at sakasandcompany.com, as well as on other sites like HubSpot, Shopify, Bureau of Digital, and more. All right, well, enough about me. let's talk about you. Think about your ideal day. In this photo here, we have, sitting at the edge of the dock, looking out on the lake. But your ideal day could be something else. You could be doing something active. You could be taking in the experience of being in the city. It's your ideal day. You get to decide what it is. And here's a preview of an exercise that I do with my clients and in my Work Less, Earn More bootcamp. Imagine that it is 5 years from now. If you're watching this live, so now you're thinking it's going to be sometime in mid to late 2028, 5 years in the future. So think to yourself, what is happening during your ideal day five years from now? What is your schedule? What are you doing? Which people are you seeing and interacting with in your day? There's no right answer. This is your ideal day. Now, I would encourage you and challenge you to spend more time reflecting on your ideal, because once you know what your ideal is, well, you can work backwards to get there. Something to think about as a framework as you're considering that is to think about the agency roles that you are filling at the moment and that you want to fill in the future. In my work, I've identified 6 agency role categories. We'll talk more about that in the Work Less, Earn More book. Here's a preview of the 6 categories. And as you hear these, think about which ones you're handling now. You could certainly do more than one, and which ones you want to do in the future. First one is account management, or AM. That's about keeping the clients happy and usually identifying ways to sell them more services. We've also got project management, or PM. That's usually about delivering your client work, whether it's a project or a retainer, smoothly and profitably. There are the SME, subject matter expert roles. Those will vary depending on your agency services. That's all about doing the highly billable craft work of your agency. AM and PM are still billable. SMEs, though, tend to be the most billable. Those will be people doing design, development, writing, analysis, and so on. You also have the client strategist role, or the strategist role. The strategist is a bit of a combo of account management and SME. The key difference is that the strategist role is about maximizing the return on investment of your client's budget. They have a certain budget, and the strategist is looking at how do we best deploy that to get the client results. There's also biz dev, business development, which I define as 3 things. It's not just sales, it's marketing, sales, and partnerships. It's about building relationships and getting people in the door at your agency to help more clients. And finally, the 6th agency role, as you consider these, is support. That is operations and leadership. It's thinking about how to get your agency running smoothly, both short-term and long-term. And again, as you think about these, you're probably doing more than one right now, and that's okay. But if it isn't the combo of roles that you want to do, well, you can change that. And it starts by you're looking to find a path to get there. It starts by prioritizing your time. Whatever your ideal day is, if you want to get there, well, it won't happen by magic. That tends not to work very well. As an agency owner or someone in a leadership role who's supporting the owner, your time ultimately fits into several categories. But before we look at some of those categories, it helps to consider, what if things just aren't getting done, right? I mentioned, you might be getting interrupted all day long. Here's a Venn diagram that I've developed for you to consider. The 3 things in the Venn diagram are desire, competence, and capacity. If something isn't getting done, you're missing at least one of these, maybe 2, and possibly all 3. And if you have a team member who is struggling to get things done, they could be missing some of these as well. Remember, you need all 3. Desire is, do you want to do it? Competence is, do you know how to do it? And capacity is, do you have time to do it? For instance, if you have desire and competence but not capacity, that's often true for agency owners. It's just not going to get done. You don't have time. If it's desire and capacity but not competence, maybe you've hired a new team member who doesn't know how to do it yet, they're probably going to do it poorly. And finally, say you've got a team member who has competence and capacity, but not desire, they're going to avoid doing it. And if you've hired someone, for instance, who can do the job but doesn't want to do the job you need them to do, I would call them a reluctant employee. And you don't want reluctant employees. One other thing to think about around your overall time in general is what your day-to-day is like. And I'm glad to expand a bit on this in Q&A. But ultimately, your day-to-day involvement is likely fitting into one of 4 stages, and you can be in more than one at once. Initially, and we could think of this as a fuel gauge or a gas or petrol gauge, initially you're mandatory. You're doing everything, you just can't get away. Then stage 2 is necessary. Your team's handling things, though not always very well. Then stage 3 is needed. You've gone from needed up to needed from necessary. And you can take time off, you can go on vacation or holiday. Your team's generally taking care of things. You can't disappear forever, but things are better. And if you want, you could go from stage 3 needed to stage 4 optional, where you are just that. You are optional. That's especially important if you want to sell your agency, you want to do an exit, but it's helpful if you lean toward running a lifestyle agency as well, because now you're doing only the things you choose to do because you're optional rather than what you have to do, which may be the case now. So how do we put this all together? Well, I've got a framework for that and a free tool, which you can get. Hang in until we get to Q&A. I'll share how to get that. Consider that your time fits into buckets, categories or buckets. And you might have these granularly listed in your time tracking system. Here are some possible categories. We've got long-term strategy, that's thinking about the future and taking time with your leadership team to make it all happen. We've got business development. We've got managing people and things related to culture and recruiting. We've got all of the client billable work, AM, PM, client strategy, SME work, things like that. And you also have some internal things like professional development, administrative time. You had to have some other things as well. Now, to help you organize all of this and start shifting it, I've created a tool that I call the Time Bucket Template. It's a Google Sheets template. And the idea is that you list, based on the categories, where are you spending your time now? And importantly, what do you want that to be in the future? A lot of agency owners want to get rid of their SME work, the subject matter expert work. If you're trying to think of things to get rid of, usually makes sense to get rid of your SME work. You can delegate that to freelancers or existing employee team members. Then your project management, since that tends to be somewhat in the background. You might then get rid of account management. You might still be doing client strategy for a while, but you're also not the day-to-day person at that point. And then up to you. You might continue doing business development. You'll still do support, the leadership portion to some extent, but it starts by getting clear on where you are now and then what you want that to be. Now, speaking of getting there, well, you're going to have to push back diplomatically on the demands on your time that don't fit your ideal. And it's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be sudden. It's not going to be instant. But consider, it is not rude to set boundaries on your time. It is not rude to set boundaries. Just because someone is a client doesn't mean they get access to you on a 24/7 basis. And just because a team member thinks it's urgent doesn't mean you need to treat it as urgent yourself. Yes, you will need to take some action, but you get to decide the timeline. So if we go beyond the time bucket template alone, and I'll share the opt-in for that shortly, it helps to have tools to push back. I mentioned some of those frameworks to help you think about that. Let's look at some tips to help. And I have 5 tips in particular. And of course, you'll have this in the recording if you want to refer back to any of these. Start by defining swim lanes. That is, who's in charge of what. And you can use an RC, A-R-C-I, or RACI, R-A-C-I, matrix to get there. The idea is that if you're starting a new client engagement, you're starting an internal initiative, you're thinking about just how do things work in general, you can make a list. who is accountable, that is, who's the owner of that particular thing happening, who is responsible, that is the person who is hands-on in making things happen for that particular task or that particular area of your agency or particular part of a client engagement, who is consulted. These are people that need to be consulted before things are finalized, but they may not be the primary person responsible for doing it. And finally, who needs to be informed? That's the I in ARCI. Informed is someone who needs to know at some point that it happened, but they may not be informed until after things are done. Now, why is this important? Well, in my work with hundreds of agencies, often there are bottlenecks where someone doesn't realize that they're responsible for something. There can be drama if someone, for instance, should be consulted, but they're not, or where someone is informed, but they think they should be consulted. If you get clear on the swim lanes, and you can use RC to help make that happen, there tends to be less confusion, less duplicate work, less in the way of situations around, fewer situations where something didn't happen because no one realized, and ideally less drama along the way. Now, if you get a lot of questions from your team and it seems like they're expecting you to solve all of their problems, or maybe someone comes to you and they're not expecting you to solve all of their problems, but you just launch into that and do it anyway, the 3 A's will be your friend. What are the 3 A's? Well, the 3 A's are aware, advise, and actively involved. And here's how you use that. Someone on your team comes to you with something, and you can ask them, or they ideally, you train them to volunteer. They would say, I'm bringing this to you solely so you are aware. I don't need your advice. I don't need you to be actively involved. This is just so you're aware. I've got it. Or they might come to you and say, hey, this has happened. I need your advice. I need you to advise me. And then you can advise them. But notably, you're not getting actively involved. Or there can be situations where someone comes to you and needs your help and they ask you to be actively involved. Now, as the owner or as an agency leader, you always have the option to escalate. For instance, someone comes to you and makes you aware and they tell you about the plan. If there's a problem with their plan, you can say, I need to share some further advice on this, and you can advise them. Or maybe they say, this has happened. I need your advice. There may be some things that you know that they don't know, and you need to become actively involved. You can always escalate. But if you keep getting sucked into your team's problems, start by using and training your team on the 3 A's. It's possible that you're getting more involved than you need to be and than you want to be. Tip number 3 is about reserving heads down time to focus. This is a powerful shift in your schedule. That's where you block in time on your calendar, ideally at least 2 hours long, although in my work with agencies, things like 3 or 4 hours can work better. You might go to a coffee shop rather than your usual workspace just to get away and not have people interrupt you. And that heads down time lets you focus on what is most impactful. Now, pick a time that works well for you. Some people will choose Friday mornings or Friday afternoons to get it done. Other times they'll pick another morning in the week, or it could be later in the day. The key here is to find a time where you can focus. Now, for that to work, your team needs to know, 1, don't interrupt you while your head's down. You'll have it in your calendar. It'll be locked out. And you also want to have some time before and after the heads down time, whether that's internal office hours where you're available to answer questions, or you have specific conversations with people about answering questions, so that ultimately, if people do need answers, either before or after heads down time, they can get them, rather than having to figure everything out if they do, in fact, need your input. And you also want to define escalation paths. What are things that do merit interrupting you? There may be some things, and you can sort that out with your team. Tip number 4 out of the 5 here is about delegating client billable work. I touched on that a bit earlier. The idea is that the more you are doing client billables yourself as an agency owner or a leader, it's going to be harder to set boundaries on your time. For instance, as an agency project manager, although I was also doing account management in that role, I had a client who loved talking to people on our team, to me as his day-to-day contact or to the strategist we had assigned to his account. And he was often there was a lot of urgency. He was so eager to speak with us. Sometimes I'd be in a meeting and I would hear my phone ring at my desk. And then I would start hearing all of the other phone extensions in the office ring because he was calling everyone because he wanted to talk to someone. The more clients you are client facing to, the harder it'll be to set boundaries. Of course, there are some things you can do and all, but I'm glad to answer more questions on that in Q&A. Ultimately, ideally delegate certainly day-to-day account management, the SME roles and project management. So even if you are still doing client strategy, it's on a scheduled basis rather than people just texting you at all hours. And tip number 5, and if you want to get a screenshot, here's all 5 tips in one place. Be sure to model the behavior you want. For instance, in addition to doing your own heads down time, your team might do heads down time as well because they've got stuff they need to do. But respect that heads down time. If you need something from someone and it is not truly urgent, either wait until after their heads down time or reach out via a method that doesn't interrupt them and ideally acknowledge, hey, I realize you're not going to get to this until later today, kind of thing like that. You want to model the behavior. That also includes taking time off for yourself. If you tell your team to, take breaks and you never do, well, your behavior is telling them that your words don't matter and that they should focus on your actions, not your words. Ideally, your words and actions will be aligned. So how do we make everything align? Well, you can get free access as we shift here into Q&A. And Amelia, I'm looking forward to answering questions that we have. You can get free access to the time bucket template. If you scan the QR code here, you can get it, or you can also go to bit.ly/Sakas Toggl. That's all lowercase bit.ly/SAKAS Toggl. You'll get the time bucket template. You also get my email newsletter that more than one agency owner has said is the only email they read every time. And also, if you're one of the first 25 people to sign up for this, you'll get a free ebook copy of the Work Less, Earn More book available to you to help you work less and earn more. So, Amelia, what is the first question?
So guys, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I forgot to mention in the beginning of the session, but we do have some time allocated for Q&A, which I myself have some questions for Karl. So we'll get cracking. I will also maybe just keep this on for another minute, so people could scan the barcode and QR code and download the resources. But so while we chat, I'll just keep it up for another minute. And so something you mentioned time and time again was sort of about letting go of certain tasks and delegating. But what if I like doing the client work, or somebody who's listening actually enjoy it? Should they let it go because it's wrong for them to do, or how do they approach this?
If you like doing client work, keep doing client work. But make sure you're doing the type of client work that you want to do. For instance, if you love doing client strategy, keep doing client strategy. But you probably don't need to be the person who is answering, each client's every day-to-day question or scheduling the meetings or things like that. Because keep in mind that clients tend to value strategy more than the other roles. And they can tend to pigeonhole people. For instance, I mentioned the client who would call all of the phone extensions in the office. One day he called and he was like, I need to talk to his strategist. And she was out of the office. I said she was out of the office. Sometimes would need to tell him she was not available when maybe she was, but she was in fact away that day. And I said, but I've worked on this before, the thing he'd asked about. thinking in another agency. And I said, let me walk through what you can do. And at the end of that, he was like, wow, because I remember I had a project manager title. He said, wow, I'm surprised you knew how to do that. And it's like, yeah, I've done it before. I think people tend to assume that their project manager and or account manager may not be a strategist, and kind of it depends on the person. So make sure you're doing the client-facing work that you want to do, and I would encourage you to delegate the SME, the subject matter expert work, first, along with the project management. You might still need to do some account management, especially for your biggest clients. The key with all of this is get clear on what you want and then delegate the rest, either to your existing team or you may need to hire additional people for the future.
Mm-hmm. And mentioning hiring, so something you kind of like mentioned in one of your diagrams was the reluctant employee, which I've never kind of like heard of before. But I mean, it
Yeah,
makes absolute sense, right? So
yeah,
I was really interested to hear more about that, like about the reluctant employee, because hiring is tough. And like obviously quite often it's not the CEO who will be doing the hiring, but like maybe they are hiring for like, like a pretty high up, like, the lateral role, and like they will be
yeah.
involved. So how do you filter this out? Like, how do you even like, how do you approach about getting these employees who will be able to do the job that you're trying to delegate?
Well, here's a magic question you can ask in the hiring process. And before you ask the magic question, you need to sort out for a particular role what are the work types they're going to do and what is your ideal percentage mix of that. For instance, if you have an account manager, they're probably doing they're doing account management. They might be doing some project management, and they might also be doing some client strategy. Or they might be doing something else. They might be supporting sales, for instance. But let's say it's AM, PM, and client strategy. You need to think about what's the ideal percentage mix of those. Maybe it, for instance, is 80% account management, 10% project management, 10% strategy. Whatever the answers are, figure out what those are. And then the magic question is this: ask your candidates for the role. This role involves three things: account management, project management, and client strategy. What is your ideal mix as a percentage of those in a typical week? Now, if someone comes to you and says 80-10-10, great, that they want to do the job you need them to do. On the other hand, if someone comes to you and they say, 50% account management, 40% client strategy, and 10% project management, they're not going to be happy, right? You want them to do 10% client strategy. They want to do 40% client strategy. They're either not going to stick around or they're going to neglect their account management duties and get overly involved in strategy. And those percentages and those work types are going to be unique to each role and unique to each specific hire. But get clear on the work types they're doing, think about the ideal percentage, and then ask candidates their ideal percentage to help you sort out, do they want to do the job you need them to do?
And do you reckon these ideal percentages that they do put forward? So for example, like, somebody does say like, 50, 40, 10, whatever. And like,
Yeah.
do you think that can be adjusted, or is that like inherent in what the person is looking for, and basically it's just like not a good fit and you should kind of, move on?
It depends on how much variation there is. If someone says, mention those examples, ideally it's 80% AM and 10-10 PM and strategy. Maybe if they say, 70% account management and 20% project management and, the rest, like, okay, that you might say this does involve less project management. It's more like this. So like if it's a small difference, it shouldn't matter. But be careful about letting people in the door. There's the idea in vampire lore that you have to invite the vampire in. You don't want to invite a toxic employee into your agency. And, not every reluctant employee is toxic, but ultimately they don't want to do the job you need them to do. For instance, a friend hired a project manager several years ago who had previously been a designer. And I was not involved in the hiring process. I was just hearing about it from the friend later. They were not a client. And apparently the candidate had said, oh, yeah, I really want to do project management. But the hiring manager didn't really dig into why. Like, why are you moving from design to project management? It's not unheard of, but it's unusual. And they did clarify this is project management. You're not doing design. You're not doing creative direction, so on. And the candidate was like, oh, yes, yes. Yet day one, they started interfering with the designers and started giving creative direction, even though that was not their job. And ultimately, things just got worse and worse. They eventually fired the team member. And then she then made some claims against the company, and they had to pay a settlement to end things. That's not good. They could have avoided that if they had dug in about, well, why are you switching? If, for instance, they had said, oh, here's why, I've actually been doing project coordination all along, and I really like that. And this and that. And I've done a project management training, and I've gone to the Bureau of Digital PM Summit. And like if they had demonstrated that career change was a sincere interest, it probably would have been okay. But in this case, what I think probably was happening was they were looking for a job, and they figured, well, they don't want to be a PM, but there's job openings, so let's apply for the job, and they can, take that as a backdoor approach to doing design work after all. And that ended up being pretty expensive for the agency.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. I mean, like, thank you for going on this tangent. It was not like necessarily related much to the topic, but like I found it very interesting. So coming back to the actual topic that we spoke about, another thing like kind of caught my attention was setting boundaries, which makes absolute sense, right? Like if you're willing to give away your time, people will take it. As simple as that. But I feel like what happens quite often is there's like a bit of that habit thing. Like if a client emails you on a Sunday night and you respond, that's where the expectation is that you are available, right? So it's easy to set these boundaries from the beginning, but what if you've been available? What if you have let them claim all of your time? So like setting these boundaries can feel for the clients kind of like, like a rejection. Like, what do you mean? Like, I was able to do that. Now I'm not able to do it anymore. So how do you go around like, reshaping these boundaries when a client has already set their foot much deeper than they should have?
There are a few ways to approach it, and I think you've recognized a very important thing, which is that once you've set a precedent, once you've done it one way, people don't always like it when you change. So a few things to consider. One, let's say you might be, looking at your work email on Sunday. Okay, you could, for instance, if you want to, you could draft a response, but don't send it until Monday. Or you could draft it and use whether Boomerang or the Gmail send later feature, things like that, to send it on Monday. So that's an option, right? If it's because of you and the client doesn't expect a response on Sunday, like, we'll just schedule it or otherwise send it later. Great. Now, if it's a client that is overly demanding and they expect the turnaround, it's going to be a good opportunity to define what the service level agreement is, the SLA, on how fast you're responding to things. For instance, in my executive coaching, if someone sends a routine question, my goal, and I share this up front, is to respond to people within 2 business days. But that's the target response. If someone sends a particularly complicated question, or for instance, I'm at an event or things like that, they'll get an autoresponder that manages their expectations about what's going on. Or say I am working, but there's a more complicated question. I may say, oh, okay, I'm going to need to dig into this. I'll need to get back to you at the end of the week on this. Or I might also, for instance, skim it to get an idea of what's going on and ask a couple follow-up questions, because I know that once I get to it, that will help. But also asking follow-up questions helps kind of restart the clock on getting back to them, right? You've done an initial response and you can do more. Now, some people are just going to be totally unreasonable. I was speaking with an agency owner who had a client. The client was threatening to leave. It turns out the CEO of the client, who's not the day-to-day contact, but he apparently was the kind of person who would send an email at 7 a.m. to the agency, and then at 7:45 a.m. email again and say, why haven't you responded yet? About non-urgent questions. And to be clear, if someone is reaching out for urgent support, and like say you support their website is down, or you were doing a campaign and the campaign was supposed to go out and it didn't, okay, or it went out and there was some sort of major problem, Yes, if it is truly an emergency, you need to deal with that. But if it's anyone else, some of it is you need to decide, are you willing to put up with it? If you have a client who's emailing you at 7 a.m. and then again at 7:45, why haven't you responded yet? They're never going to be happy. And they're going to react poorly to boundaries because they sound like a terrible person. And to be fair, most terrible clients aren't terrible people. They're just normal people in terrible situations. But if the client's situation is so out of control that you can't operate in a normal fashion because everything is a crisis for them, I would start looking at replacing the revenue. And this is why it's important to avoid a client concentration problem. Client concentration, I define that as getting more than 20% of your revenue from a single client. If that's the case, it's harder to get rid of clients, or you're afraid they're going to fire you. So ultimately, the stronger your business development pipeline, the more confident you can be about setting those boundaries. Some people will never accept them, in which case you need to decide when you're going to replace them.
Great. Makes sense. I mean, like, it's always kind of like probably easier said than done, but like you're not going to get it done without doing it. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
And practice makes perfect. Having a conversation, whether if you have a coach or with your members of your team, doing a practice first makes it a lot easier than doing it for the first time in the moment.
And what about setting boundaries with your team? Like how does that differ from setting boundaries with clients? Because like it can seem that like, oh, if I'm like in a superior position, I could just be like, I'm not doing it, like whatever, go away, But like it's probably not the best way to kind of set boundaries with your colleagues. So how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, for instance, instead of saying, go away, it would be like, I'm glad to help with this. I'm heads down for the next 3 hours. Could I take a look at this at blah, blah time? And they're like, oh, sure. Or they might say, there's this urgent situation. Our biggest client needs such and such. Can you help sooner? Right? Make it more of a conversation rather than just a no. It's more of a conditional. Glad to help later at this time. Things like that. You also can build internal communication standards where, for instance, if someone requests something, is on the requester to follow up if the person that got the request doesn't get back to them, right? It's not all falling to the person who's gotten the request, kind of thing. That can be helpful. It is worth considering as an agency leader, have you potentially set the expectation that people should be going to you all the time? I had a client several years ago where the owner was like, I keep getting questions all day long from my team. They're asking me about all this stuff. Like they should be able to figure it out themselves, right? They wanted the team to be more independent, which makes sense. Well, I dug into it. I had him track what were the interruptions he was getting, who were the people, generally what was the topic, and what was wrong about the inquiry. Maybe sometimes it was the right question, the wrong time. Maybe it was a question he shouldn't have gotten asked in the first place, things like that. And then I spoke with his team. And what I found was that he had unfortunately created the problem himself. When his team would make decisions on their own, he would often overrule them. And he had basically trained them that if they needed to make a decision, they should talk to him first so they didn't have to redo it all over again later. Now, the solution to that, which took some time, but as I worked with him and the team, part of it was defining swim lanes, who's in charge of what. If, for instance, something is in someone's swim lanes and they're following what I call the VGR, values, goals, and resources, if someone makes a decision that is in their area to decide, and they followed the appropriate values, goals, and resources in making the decision, the owner would not make them redo it. The owner might say, in the future, there was this additional factor that you weren't considering. Please do this differently in the future, but would not overrule them and would back them up on what they had decided. So that could help. I mean, it's not fun if you've inadvertently trained your team to go to you all the time, but that does mean if it's your fault, you can fix it as well.
Perfect. All right. And to wrap it up, I have one last question, which I think might be the most kind of like important one. So, you've shared a lot of knowledge, a lot of tips. So say like, somebody watched this session and they want to get doing, like, they want to get doing things. So what
Yes.
is the first thing to do tomorrow morning or on Monday? Like, how do you start? Where do you start? Basically, the first easy step to get moving.
The first easy step would be to fill out the time bucket template. That is, look at where are you spending your time, the percentages. I know we have the QR code to get that. Where are you spending your time now, and what do you want that to be? Because if you know that, you can start making changes. You might see, for instance, you're spending a lot of time on team management and you want to do less of that. Well, some of that involves going from a flat hierarchy to having other people manage others, so you're not managing everyone yourself. A client did that, for instance, where one of the team members has stepped up to do one-on-one meetings with others on the team so that the owner isn't having to do that with everyone. Or maybe you're trying to do less on sales. Maybe one solution is to enlist a team member to help with that, or at least help with screening people at the beginning. So you can't make the changes that around where you want to get to until you're clear on where you want to go. So I would say download the time bucket template. It's free of charge at bit.ly/Sakas Toggl, and start thinking about what you want your ideal to be. That would be something that'll make things a lot better. And then you'll still have to implement, but now you'll know where to focus.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was a great session, very useful, and I'm really excited. We're recording it, and people will be able to watch the recording as well. And yeah, so thanks everybody who joined to watch it live. If you do have any questions for me, for Karl, the contact details will be listed, in the descriptions. Basically, they are listed in the description. So feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, on social media, whatever, and reach out. And I'm excited to have you guys on other sessions. We will have another one in September, basically like usual, every month. And thank you so much, Karl, for joining us. And hopefully it wasn't the last time we were having you on Toggl Academy sharing your knowledge.
Glad to be back. Thanks, Amelia.